This is the Court of International Trade, which found essentially that the Economic Powers Act did not provide the president with as broad authority as he's claiming to implement tariffs here. It comes down to a question of what is a national emergency and what is a time of war. And
Can Congress legally delegate this power?
I'm not sure that the Court of
International trade
ruling will hold up on appeal. I do suspect that ultimately the courts are going to go back to what they have said before, which is that in the Constitution, tariff authority resides with Congress. Congress made a pretty broad grant of that authority to the executive branch. And what the courts have said in the past is that Congress has a fix. If Congress believes this power is being abused, then they should reclaim their constitutional authority. Where our system of checks and balances falls down a little bit is that, this particular Congress has not shown a great appetite for constraining this particular executive. So even though there have been noises in Congress from both sides, both Republican and Democrat, about reclaiming this authority, whether or not there's enough political will to actually do so on the Republican side is something that I think is, unclear.
How have the recent tariffs affected people's ability to perform under commercial contracts?
I think it's changing, and I think it is a dynamic situation. When we had tariffs at a level of 140% or higher, directed at Chinese products, we got a lot of inquiries from clients saying we cannot economically meet this tariff level. And we can't economically meet this tariff level even if the counterparty agrees to split it with us 50-50. So when you're talking about tariff levels that are almost designed, I think, to be prohibitive, which I think the president has said that, essentially they were designed to stop commerce with China. I think they had that effect when they're at that 140, 145% level. As things have come down to kind of a baseline level, I think parties view those baseline levels, of 10% or so as more manageable, but each contract is going to be different, and each price point or price pressure, depending on the industry, depending on the product, et cetera, you're going to have different sort of squeal points as to where a contract becomes uneconomic. At 140%, lots of parties saying, I just can't perform, I'll go out of business. At these lower levels, I think you're seeing more space for negotiation.
Under U.S. common law, what factors determine whether a force majeure clause can be invoked due to tariffs or trade policy changes?
It can vary from state to state in the U.S., but generally force majeure clauses can be invoked when the force majeure event is not the fault of the party or is beyond the control of the party claiming force majeure. The event is also captured or falls within the force majeure clause itself. And then critically, and this is where we get a lot of discussion with respect to tariffs, is the event prevents or delays a party's performance. So that last point with respect to tariffs can be a little bit of a stumbling block because in the typical force majeure scenario, where a party is facing an increased cost of performance rather than an inability to perform or a delay in performance, that's usually not force majeure. Usually increased costs are not considered a delay or a prevention of performance. I think the pandemic gave us a good example on how parties also shifted their language to, to capture this specific incident. But, during the pandemic, parties were specifically writing into their contracts that if they were not able to obtain equipment, or if there was some kind of a prohibition or embargo, a closed port or something like that due to the pandemic, that was considered an event of force majeure. And if a party could then show that that event was preventing them from performing, then that is, what a typical force majeure scenario would be. But you do see them for weather, you do see them for uh, wartime events, you see them for embargoes, you do see them related to government action and government delay and permitting at some times. So there are a number of scenarios, but it's usually some event that is outside of the party's control. Often an act of God, but not always. Sometimes just an unanticipated change in policy or change in law that makes performance illegal or that is something that prevents you from being able to fulfill your contractual obligation.
How do courts rule on force majeure cases due to tariffs?
I think courts take a pretty practical approach with these clauses. They look at the four corners of the clause, and if there's a, reasonable, straightforward interpretation that this clause, even though it's broad, was intended to capture this type of event, then, some courts may find that force majeure for tariffs is a government action. But there's not a uniform set of, cases out there. And where I think most of these arguments are going to fall down is not whether or not the court says that this is theoretically an event, a government action that could be defined as force majeure, but more, as we talked about, whether or not the tariff is actually preventing you from fulfilling your obligation.
How can companies negotiating new contracts mitigate risks from potential tariff disruptions?
A good example of what practical steps parties have been taking is in the solar industry. So, in the solar industry, going back to either 2022 or 2021, I can't remember, but we had a big anti-dumping and countervailing duty inquiry that was instituted at the Department of Commerce. And that was directed at Southeast Asian solar panels. And it ultimately imposed higher import duties on certain Southeast Asian solar panels. And the reason why I give that example is because we're now in a period of time, 3 years later, where a lot of parties had looked at that possibility of those import duties going up because of that Auxin Solar and that Department of Commerce investigation, and they allocated for that in the contract. And the way they allocated for that in the contract was usually by a price adjustment clause, or in the case of a solar deal where you're buying a whole asset, a whole facility, there may be actually a purchase price adjustment for the facility based on the unanticipated equipment cost by increased tariffs. So you're seeing parties start to negotiate those. And they do that not only in change of law, in force majeure clauses, but also in change of law clauses, purchase price adjustment clauses. If you have enough data points about your deal to know that, that price increases for a particular piece of equipment or material could put your deal, upside down, then that's something where each party is going to know where that pressure point is. But since in some transactions, like an energy and renewable energy transaction where the margins are a little bit thin, those price points are going to impact your deal. Parties addressing them and trying to negotiate and allocate for that risk in before the crisis happens rather than after is really the best advice that you can give. There's other practical things that you can do. So a lot of what's going on right now is directed at China, and the China is sort of the number one target in terms of impacting U.S. policy, attempting to impact how our businesses are operating. And so, more of a pivot away from China probably makes sense for companies as they're looking at these tariffs because, I think China is still going to occupy most of our foreign policy directives in terms of wanting to achieve more economic parity in the world in terms of trade. So I think we'll continue to see more pivot away from China. So if companies can diversify their supply chains, if they can do more onshoring or nearshoring or direct their production to countries where it looks like we're creating deals where there may be some opportunity for some tariff relief. I think those are practical things. I think looking at your change in law clauses and addressing these risks, which are becoming increasingly known, are things that are also important at this point in time. And some parties are doing early procurement as well. We saw a big front load of orders in the last quarter in anticipation for the tariffs being implemented. So you may see more of that. You may see more front loading or advancement of your procurement.
Do force majeure clauses interact with other contractual mechanisms?
Those other clauses are probably better mechanisms for capturing incremental increases in costs of performance. So I think change in law is a better mechanism for capturing that, because what you're doing is you're not talking about an inability to perform, you're talking about altered economic terms. And those are altered economic terms based on a change in law. That's a good mechanism for parties to capture the potential tariff risk here. And we already talked about price adjustment clauses. Those sometimes can be implemented as well to capture a tariff risk. I've seen them where parties agree that, one party will bear this first, amount, and the next party will bear the second level of amount, et cetera. There's all sorts of creative ways that you can do that. In M&A deals where equipment is particularly important to the value of the deal, you also may see material adverse change clause implicated. Those clauses are typically designed to capture a material change in the value of the asset after your deal has closed. So if you had a 145% tariff, for example, that dramatically changed your price of producing a kilowatt of power, that altered the economics of a deal, for example, in a material way, then those material adverse change clauses might also give you a termination right or a purchase price adjustment of some sort.
What are the evidentiary obstacles in proving tariffs rendered contracts impossible rather than just more difficult?
I mean, I think you literally have to prove that statement to be true that you just said, or more likely than not, that statement is true. So I had a case a number of years ago before any of this recent stuff involving the procurement of nuclear fuel for power plants, and that case happened. It related to the Fukushima disaster, and it happened post Fukushima. And what could be more kind of on all fours for a force majeure question than you have a massive tsunami and earthquake destroying your facility? In that scenario, your obligation was only to purchase nuclear fuel for your power plants. It wasn't dependent upon you having a nuclear power plant at all. So and there, what our decision makers found was that your obligation is just to take fuel and pay for fuel. You don't have to use it. So they found that wasn't impeding your performance. Now, they had no economic use for the fuel. I mean, I suppose you could resell it, but the question there is, unless the actual payment systems went down where you couldn't physically pay for something, this party wasn't able to prove that they were unable to perform, even though they had no use for the product. You're really going to have to, I think, convince a judge or arbitrator that the cost of performance was so high that it is tantamount to a prohibition on inability to perform. And if I were making those arguments, I might cite some of the language that President Trump has used in some of his public statements, where he said things like, we're going cold turkey on China. He clearly said that at least you can infer that the idea was that these amounts are going to be so high that trade between our two countries will stop. Well, does that change the character between whether or not this is just increased costs, or is this really something that's designed to be a prohibition where the costs are so high that everyone recognizes that performance has been rendered impossible?
What advice do you have for companies dealing with tariffs?
The advice that I give clients is going to be different depending upon the individual contract. I do think that if there is an opportunity to find business continuity through negotiation, that a lot of parties are disposed to exploring that right now rather than blowing these contracts up and calling them broken or terminated. I think the most important thing is to communicate with your counterparty to have an understanding of whether or not, if you're the customer, whether or not the supplier is going to have difficulties performing what their plan is, and if they aren't going to be able to perform because of the increased costs, what are some alternative scenarios? So I think you need to explore all of that. You have to get very knowledgeable about your supply chain, the different inputs, where different products are coming from, what the price sensitivities might be from those regions because they're a particular country of concern or things of that nature. So it's an open dialogue, I think, and it's really a question of the economics of each individual deal at the end of the day, I think, and it's really a question of the economics of each individual deal at the end of the day.